But I think we both know what men are like.
Meet again.
1 year and a half goes by. I get a phone call from Jimmy Harris, and his words, well, I'll never forget. Joe, come on down to the studio. We want to discuss taking you to Europe with us. Whoa. What picture? He says. The Shining. Paths of Glory. Whoa. I didn't know anything about it, but Europe. Whoa. Going to Europe. I go to the studio, see Jimmy, see Stanley. How are you guys? How's everything? Hey, Stanley. And I forgot, and he winced again, and I shook his hand. No hugs. The script was superb. As you know, Paths of Glory. The film cost on that picture, start to bottom, start to finish, was $990,000. Totally. And as Bob Dylan said, times they are a-changing. They sure are. They sure have. Stanley's technique was different. Oh, I could see that right away. He had more. Incidentally, The Killing was $375,000 to make. And this one was $990,000. Okay. Stanley's technique has changed. He was more sure of himself, but he wanted to see it over. More meticulous. Again, try it this way, do it that way. He wanted to get it perfect. That was obvious. One day, and when I say one day, I used to go to the studio early, and I like to get into costume and get on the set and get familiar with what I'm going to do that day and think of what I did yesterday as opposed to what I'm doing today, how it'll affect tomorrow, and get comfortable. And he went to the set also early. We chatted many, many times, conversations by ourselves. And then during the course of the shooting, there was all the cast and crew. We were all talking to each other. One day, difficult scene, Adolphe Menjou and George McCready in one of the early scenes, I think the very first scene in the picture. And it was a 10-pager. And it was a difficult scene. Take 12, 13, 16, 17, 19. And Menjou at the time was 55 and 60. 20th take, Menjou's going, "What the goddamn?" Whoa, he started to scream. "I've done this son of a bitch 20 times. What do you want of me, Mr. Kubrick? Am I not on my spots? Is Mr. McCready not on his spots? Is he blowing dialogue? Am I? God damn, I've done the son of a bitch 20. I've been in this business." You talk about not a pin. I'm talking about a feather, not a movement. And I'm standing in the back. Not a soul moved. Nobody. And he's wailing and railing at at Stanley. And I'm talking about the words. I'm being gentle. And Stanley is standing there, just like this. He had a little mannerism, hands like this, combing his hair. He still had hair. Just like this, looking at Menjou. And this tirade lasted at least a minute and a half. And there wasn't, not even, oh God. Finally he stopped. "Mr. Menjou, first of all, you're doing beautifully. Your performance is lovely. You're on your spot, the marks are hit. The performance is magical." "Then God damn it, when you get ready!" Oh. Stood back again. Did this again. "Mr. Menjou, Mr. McCready is doing extremely well. But it's a very difficult scene. The camera is moving. It's choreography here. You're moving. Your spots are moving. Everything is moving. Everybody is moving in concert. It's choreography. I just want to get it a little bit better. It's perfect now, but I want to get it a little bit better." And that was Stanley's creed his whole life. I want to do it better than it's ever been done before. Period. And he said, "Please, Mr. Menjou," in such a quiet way, in such an entreating way, practically pleading, "Please, Mr. Menjou, I'd appreciate it very much. Let's try it again, won't you? Mr. McCready, would that be all right? I mean, am I asked, please, won't you do that for me?" "All right, let's do the son of a bitch. Menjou, let's Well, they did it. Stanley said, "Cut, print. Let's go to the next setup." And I must stop again. Stanley Kubrick printed every take that the camera was rolling. Even if a fellow had a job of coming through the door and saying something and blowing the line immediately, whatever it was, he printed it. He printed everything. Hundreds of takes later on in his other films. Prints everything. And one day I asked him, I said, Stanley, why? He says, Joe, there may be a snippet. There may be 10 frames, 20 frames, when it's perfect. And then I could maybe use a scissor, get in there, cut to something else, and I could use that moment that was better than anything else. And I want to see what's been done. So maybe I can find that little moment that'll work. That's the way he was. That's the way Stanley Kubrick worked. Printed everything. And they printed that last one with Monjou. All right, thank you. Yes, all right, thank you, Mr. Monjou. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Mr. McCready, thank you very much. And during this whole thing, I must tell you, George McCready, of the McCready Scottish acting family, he was standing there, didn't move a muscle while Monjou was going berserk, with a patrician air. Not a sound came out of George McCready, not a word, not a movement. He was delightful. That's just the way Stanley was. One day, Sunday, we weren't working. I left the hotel early, and there's Stanley Kubrick and Ralph Meeker standing out talking. I walk over, hi, guy. Hey, Turk, how you doing? Fine. What are you going to do today? I had an idea of what I wanted to do, and I said, listen, guys, we're here in Munich, and let's go to Dachau concentration camp. Stanley looked, Ralph looked, we're in a cab, we're there. Incidentally, Dachau, in case you don't know, was named after a street. That horrible place was named after Dachaustrasse. And all he had to do to get there is go straight out Dachaustrasse a couple of miles, and there it was. And I know you're thrilled to hear that information. You couldn't have gotten through the day without out where Dachaustrasse was. Well, it's a hairy place. We get out, and the first place we go to is this huge place where they gassed everybody. That had a Brausbad, which is a bath, I guess. I walked in, Stanley walked in, and Stanley and Ralph peeled off to the right. It was a huge place, about a little bigger than this room, and they peeled off to the left, and I went to the right. And I see signs on the wall, beware, the murderers are still loose, and it was heartbreaking. Signs in every language. I couldn't understand any of them, naturally, of every language, and people were lamenting what was happening here. And all of a sudden, I hear Stanley Kubrick laughing. And Ralph Meeker laughing. I said, Jesus, what the hell are these guys laughing about? Certainly, this is no place to be laughing. And we looked around some more, and they were wandering around. The giggling kept on. So Stanley called me. He says, come on, Turk, let's go to the barracks right next door. And as we went to the door, I looked up, and Stanley Kubrick was crying. And Ralph Meeker was crying. Not tears running down their cheek, but they had tears right in their eyes. And it was obvious. What they were doing is trying to make some silly little gag or joke or something to take the pressure off, to make it less horrible than it was. In fact, Ralph Meeker's last joke was, God, they must have had some gas bill each month. And that's funny, but he had to do that, and he did it to keep from breaking down altogether, just to keep some sort of sense of reality or humor. We get outside, and Ralph Meeker starts leaving. And Stanley, what's the matter, Ralph? He says, my name is not Ralph Meeker. My name is Ralph Rodgaber, and I'm German. How am I going to explain to my family? Well, and he started to just lose it. Stanley looks at him, and he says, I didn't know you were German, Ralph. You're fired. And that's exactly what Ralph did. He laughed. But on top of the laughter, he started to cry more. Then Stanley started to go, and I was gone. So there's three. Kafka lives. This is Kafka. This is lunacy. Chaplin would give his left, he would have given his left one if he could have attained that kind of laughter and tears at the same time was the main goal of Chaplin. Let me tell you. Well, we got into the cab, and we started to settle down a little. We all got back to the hotel. And I found out later that Stanley went to bed at 9 o'clock that night. Ralph Meeker went to the bar and got loaded on about a dozen Steinhagers. I had a date called her up, said I had to cancel it. And the three of us went to bed at 8, 9 o'clock. We were so, it was a terrible experience. The reason I mention it is that Stanley's primary concern was to see that his performer was not getting torn up to the point where he can't control himself. His humanity was to make the other fellow feel better while he himself was crying. That was Stanley. One day, about a week later, excuse me, Stanley, let me ask you a question. Do you mind? Where did you learn all this stuff? I mean, how did you get started? How come you're a director? Where did you learn all this? He says, I went to the movies. By the thousands. I went to the movies. 2 theaters a day during summer. You know, the summer vacation, we have July and August off. I go to Times Square every day. I'd win the money at the chess parlor, the chess places, win the money there and go to the movies in the afternoon. See 2 movies a day sometimes if I like the picture. I must tell you, I don't know if any of you have been to New York or have seen Times Square. Times Square was 1 block. 1 block was this way, and you cross the street and come back that way. 1 block, but 2 sides of the street. On one side of the street was 9 movie houses, right in a row. Cross the street, 8 coming back the other way. 17 movie houses in 1 block. And I used to go there all the time myself. And Stanley went there constantly to see movies. He says, after a while, you get to recognize, if you have a brain at all, the good pictures from the bad ones. You get to recognize the good actors from the bad ones. You get to recognize the good directors from the bad ones. You can see angles, shots, composition, and all of it. Flow, pace, tempo, music, timing, editing. Don't forget, Joe, I had a camera. I was in love with the camera. And I used to sit in the movie and say, if I were doing that, I would do it this way. I would do it that way. That's how he learned. He says, I read every damn book ever written about how to make movies. You know, the how-to books. He says, I read them all. They were all rubbish. Most of them were just replicas of each other. He says, I read one book that I still use today, that I turn the pages on occasionally today. I still use it. It's my Bible of how to make films. And that book was Pudovkin on Film. Pudovkin. Pudovkin, a Russian writer and a Russian analyst and author on films. He says, I still use that book. It's great. That's it. I said, Stanley, let me ask you something. Who are your favorite directors? And he stopped. He said, well, Max Ophuls, Luis Buñuel, The Razor Blade Across the Eye, stunned the world. Lubitsch, with his never-ending camera, never cutting. Orson, naturally, Orson Welles. Robert Wise, all heavyweights. One day, he came over to me, we were shooting. He says, Joe, I'm going to have to take this line of yours out. And Emil, will you come over here, please? The fellow that played the priest in Paths of Glory. I'm going to have to take your line out, too. These 2 lines have to go. I said, Stanley, this is the meat and potatoes of the scene and the very core of my character. You take this line out, and you can't do it. And then he looked down. He said, I have no choice. He said, I have to do it. The second he looked down and averted his eyes, I got the message. It was out of his hands. It wasn't of his making. The 2 lines, the priest's line and my line, were this. The priest looks at me and he says, mankind has steadily improved since the dawn of Christianity. And my line was, mankind, Father, has steadily improved since the dawn of mankind. The part I played in the film, Paths of Glory, was an atheist. A very nervous atheist, ready to go over the top, and very, very frightened and aware of what was going on in war. So he says, I got to do it. Well, don't ask me how, don't ask me by who, but pressure was exerted on Stanley, period. He wasn't his own boss. And I think those early experiences where he had no control made him into a controlled buzzsaw that he became later in his career. This kills me. How a man can think of this. We're rehearsing one day. Ralph Meeker, myself, and Timothy Carey. And we do about 6 rehearsals. And he quietly, very gently remarks, this magical man, magical. He says, you know, we're rehearsing, and the rehearsals are good, but there's no spontaneity. There can never be spontaneity when you're rehearsing spontaneity. I'm sitting here in a chair looking at good actors trying to be spontaneous. But it's a rehearsal. That's all it is. Now, I'm going a little, but it's a rehearsal. That's all it is. Spontaneity comes only when something happens. Somebody forgets a line, he picks it up, things happen, somebody trips, a chair is pushed over. That's spontaneity. The thing crackles. He says, it's amazing. There is nothing spontaneous about it, although you're good and you're making it look spontaneous. But it's not spontaneous. I thought of that one a while. He liked surprises. Now, sure enough, about 4, 5 takes into the sequence, a surprise happened. I mean a biggie. And the lines flew, and this happened, and this happened, and it was unexpected. Meeker, one of Meeker's eyes, I played the scene with Meeker, one eye was going this way, one eye was going this, and for a second then he caught himself, and we got this, that scene crackled. And I'll never forget his line. Cut, print. What happened? I said, well, Stanley, this line, and Meeker's that line, perfect, print it, let's go to lunch. And then I said to myself, Stanley, before you go, everybody had left. Let me ask you a question, Stanley. You like surprises. This is what you really aim for, something to really crackle. Where was the surprise 2 weeks ago? Now, before I ask you this, I have no right. It's not my business. You can jump all over me if you want to, and I'll understand. But I have to ask it, please. Don't answer, but don't get mad. Where was the spontaneity when Monju blew his top a couple of weeks ago? You were there, Joe? I said, yeah, I was in the back of the set. He said, Joe, you have no right to ask any director, ever, what his technique is, why he does certain things. It's none of your business. You can discuss it, discuss the relative merits of a scene or things like that, but what a director does to achieve the desired result is none of your business. I'm going to do this one time. I'm going to tell you, don't ever ask me again. And quiet. He was always quiet. Don't ever ask me again this question, okay? I said, please, I'll never ask it, Stanley. He says, when Monju did the next scene, right after the screaming scene, his voice had changed. I heard it. I don't know if anybody else was aware of it. The tone changed. The timbre of the voice had changed. It was different. It added to his character. It enhanced his character. The agitation that he had for me was in his voice, and it played the scene beautiful. Bingo. I said, thank you. And then I thought to myself, what a man won't do. What a man won't do to get the desired result. And that's what Stanley did. He'll go to any length and anywhere to get the result that he wants, what he's looking for. Spontaneity. One day, we're shooting a scene in the trenches. Camera's point of Kirk Douglas' point of view of the trenches. And the extras were picked by George von Bloch, who was the German production manager, who did the deciphering. Okay. And during the bombing and the shelling, the extras were cowering and trembling and trying to hug the earth. And after the take was over, Stanley said, "Gee, look at that. I didn't give those guys any more instruction than to tell them, just please react to the bombardment." And all of a sudden, George von Bloch said, "Mr. Kubrick, half those men were on the Russian front 12 years ago, and the other half were fighting Patton. They weren't acting. They were cringing because they felt it." Stanley says, "Oh, my God." He says, "Come on with me, George." And he went and he apologized to the men. He says, "Fellas, I'm sorry. I forgot this is, to tell you it's going to be I told you about the bombardment, but don't be frightened. Everything is controlled. Nobody's going to get hurt. I hope I haven't hurt any of your feelings, by not being more forthcoming. And they all apologized. Yes, Mr. Jawohl, Herr Kubrick, ganz gut, ganz gut. And he says, sometimes you get a surprise when even surprise is a surprise. That was that one. Genius. Whenever we'd start a new sequence, this is... All right, guys, let's talk about the scene. Joe, you got something to say? Kirk, come on. How about some dialogue? No, how about some ideas? You don't like this line? You want to take it out? Okay. You want to add that? Sure. Let's talk about it. And he would not direct. He wanted the actors to come in. Come on with something, boys. Be creative, is what he was saying. Be creative. Give me something. Come on. And we figured out, Ralph and I talked about it later. And he listened to all the suggestions, used some, didn't use others. And Ralph and I talked about it later. He was trying to get us into the creative process where we weren't actors. We were now writers who were writing the script, and we were directors who were directing the script. I've never seen that before, where a director would pull from the actor ideas, dialogue, and make him think that this is, oh, I'm directing this, I'll say this line. New ideas, cultured ideas, ideas that resonated from thought process. And that was unique. Never saw a director do that. As the French would say, subtil, very subtle. I might say that most of my suggestions were used. Now, this is a surprise. As much of a gentleman as he was not adverse to using the vilest of language. I mean, he knew every word he knew them all. And now you know what I'm talking about. Whoa! One day, the biggest star in the business, this was told to me, this was also in print, you can read this if you read biographs of Stanley. And one of the biggest stars in the business was giving Stanley a hard time, difficult. And Stanley, always soft-spoken, never raised his voice, stood up. Who the F do you think you're talking to? I'm taking an effing walk out of here, and I don't give an F what you do. I never liked this. This is nonsense. You're demeaning me. Go and F yourself. See you later. Whoa! 8 years later, I was in China making the sand pebbles with Steve McQueen. And we were working one day. We weren't. It was rainy. Everybody was in wardrobe and makeup at 7 o'clock in the morning in China. Nothing to do because it's raining. And McQueen made a statement. Steve said, you know something? You're a nice guy in Hollywood. They'll cut your legs out from under you. The second he said that, I flashed back to Stanley. Stanley was being abused because he was a nice fellow. And Stanley stood up and snarled these invectives, these F words. But he did it silently, quietly. It was a delight. He just didn't get angry. He was in total control of himself at all times. Well, after 10 weeks, Paths of Glory came to an end. I thanked Harris. I thanked Jimmy Harris and Stanley, and they me. I said my goodbyes to cast and crew. And again, I made that dumb mistake, Stanley. It was beautiful. Shook hands, and we left. Didn't like to do any touching. That's the way he was. When that picture came out, it made an impact the likes of which have never been seen before in the history of films. To this day, the effect is still being felt. I don't know if you know this, for the past 40 years, Paths of Glory plays in a theater or on a television screen somewhere in the world every day. About 8 years, the film critics of the world, they took a poll about a year or two ago, and that wasn't very good. I'm talking about 8 years ago, the film critics took a poll about the best pictures of the year. Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory was in the top 50. Best picture in the history of films. Stanley Kubrick's was in the top, I think, 30, right in the 30s somewhere. This budding force has now become a full force of nature.